So what we're talking about is a pattern, a tendency, with constraints which are both institutional and cultural. And what we're saying is, in effect, that a kind of fatalism is evident. A more effective government machine seems unrealizable, so instead, piecemeal action is settled for, a suboptimal settlement. As part of this, the key staff search for the means of getting round the system. Informal networks are used to try to overcome or bypass the established logjam. Now, of course, the government machine faced its nemesis with the Troika. It's evident that the Troika at the beginning hadn't appreciated the dysfunctionalities at the heart of the government machine in Athens, but they learned quickly and they adjusted their strategy. An OECD study in 2011 mapped out the failings of the public administration in Athens, and the memoranda of the bailouts soon went into incredible detail as to how the operation of governments should change. By the second bailout of Greece, some 40% of the conditions imposed on Greece involved reforms to the public administration. No other country has had such a bailout agenda. The closest parallel is what the European Union has demanded of Albania and Serbia before they're allowed to join the club. More directly, the Troika seemed to share much of the diagnosis we presented here. The short-lived Papademos government agreed to create a, quote, Directorate of Planning, Management and the Monitoring of Reforms. Later, the Samaras government established a new General Secretariat for the coordination of the government as a direct result of the pressure of the Troika. All this agenda reflected the hollowness, the hole, at the center of government. So the debt crisis broke taboos. It dragged Greece's creditors into the individual ministries in Athens. Unfortunately, of course, the Troika's interventions too often looked like diktats, and they exposed raw nerves and clashes of interest. Many of the Troika's reform initiatives, it's true, were crude and clumsy, even self-defeating. We can think, for example, of the target of Greece being required to shed 50,000 public servant posts. It had no separate rationality. It was a quick budget fix. It was based on no review of actual needs. As a result, it made the setting of such targets very difficult to defend. But at the same time, we must also acknowledge that the agenda of the memoranda has led to the initiation of many reforms to the Greek public administration that were previously unthinkable. We now see more attention to questions of audits and evaluation. Sorry, 1 second. More attention to audits and evaluation that the Greek system would have ever produced by itself. We might have expected the external intervention to have had a much more catalytic effect in stimulating a serious debate in Greece over the reform of government from top to bottom. It did put issues on the agenda, but it did so in ways which became easily distorted and thwarted. In fact, it's not clear that debate over government reform in 2015 is any more advanced than it was in 2013. The reasons for this limited effect have to do with the mistakes of the Troika strategy, but they also reflect the robustness, the strength of the domestic setting we've identified here, the cultural resilience, the countervailing political interests, the institutional weaknesses, and the lack of ownership of reform, etc. Well, we've come a long way from the essential focus of our book. What we've outlined is a pattern of how governments has been run from Maximu over 5 prime ministerial periods. We say that at the centre of government has been typically a hollowness. The Prime Minister and his staff have been structurally detached from the rest of the government machine. A set of cultural values reinforces this separation. Up and down the hierarchy, the administrative machine is rigid and inefficient in its processes, and responsibility is avoided. Policy-making resources are desperately thin. Government at times has been infected with the politics of clientelism. These cultural norms are not unique to government. Instead, they are the same norms that link society and government in a reciprocal fashion. Our diagnosis also portrays the conditions that have stood against substantive change to the system. There has been variation in how prime ministers have managed their governments, of course, significant variation. But the pattern of the long-term realities is striking, and we feel it needs to be highlighted. The system has relied too much on a change of personality to bring about improvement in management. This is a solution which is too contingent and too shallow. Why, we might ask, does Greece need the Troika to say that the Prime Minister's machine is not doing its job? The answer to that question reveals the strength of the domestic factors that have prevented substantive, lasting improvements. We've tried in the book to describe the variation between prime ministers in their effectiveness of management. We've also endeavoured to explain why there hasn't been transformative change. The fact that it took the Troika to push for change, and the fact that change has still been today very limited in practice, goes to the essentials of the Greek situation. A stimulus has met a very strong domestic resilience. So it seems, as the French would say, the more things change, the more things stay the same. And my final comment is that we hope in the book to have explained why things remain the same. Thank you.